Hi everyone, my name is Drew Melton and it's an honor to be sharing with you again. It's virtual and that kind of makes us sad. We were happy to be in person with some people, be able to preach to people last time I was with you, but it's a joy to be able to share with you again in our series about Old Testament characters. And today we're tackling the character of Samson, though as you'll see in just a moment, I take it in a little bit different direction than you might expect. But let's get into it. We're going to be in the book of Judges, particularly chapter 13. So if you have a Bible there with you, please do have that in front of you. You can pause the video now if you like and go and grab a Bible. We're going to be in Judges chapter 13. But let's start in Mark chapter 9. In Mark 9, Jesus is approached by a man who has a son who has been possessed by an impure spirit, Mark tells us. The boy's father comes to Jesus, and after a series of exchanges, the man says to Jesus, "If you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." And Jesus sort of balks at this man's if. Jesus says, "If you can," and then tells him everything is possible for those who believe. This is one of Jesus' many interesting double-edged statements. And the man's response, which we find in Mark 9:24, is a statement that has in many ways defined my own journey of faith. He says to Jesus, "I do believe. Help my unbelief." I have struggled with doubt. I have struggled with certainty. I have struggled to believe sometimes. But over and over, I have found peace in the assurance that Jesus accepts a faith such as this. I do believe. Help my unbelief. Something very similar, I think, takes place here in Judges chapter 13. It's the beginning of the Samson narrative in the Old Testament. Samson isn't exactly a character that is little known or minor in our Bible stories. Perhaps if you grew up in church, you definitely know something about the character of Samson. Many of us will know the general contours of his story. He's got some crazy strength that is given to him by God. He has several conflicts with the Philistine people. Most notably, he has this confrontation with a woman named Delilah. And eventually he dies in spectacular fashion by bringing down an entire Philistine temple on himself and thousands of others. The part of Samson's story that we may not be as familiar with is his birth. Or to be precise, the story of his parents receiving the announcement of his birth. And this is the part of Samson's story that we find in Judges 13. But before we get to the particular story, we have to start with just the opening verse of chapter 13. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. This is the story of the book of Judges in a nutshell. The people of Israel were freed from their oppression under the slavery of Egypt, and they were led by Moses across the Red Sea and toward the promised land, the land that God had promised to them. And even though the people rebelled and were forced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, they entered the promised land under the leadership of Joshua. And then the book of Judges tells the story of the Israelites learning to live in the promised land. But the story of this learning process is one of cyclical failure on the part of the Israelites. They do evil in the eyes of the Lord, and then for some time they experience hardship and trial, often at the hands of an enemy people. And then God raises up a new leader, a judge, as they are called in the book of Judges, a new leader to deliver the people from that trial. And this statement in verse 1, that the Israelites are doing evil in the eyes of the Lord, sets the stage for how we should read this story about Samson. And it gives us two questions that we ought to have in our mind as we're reading. First, we should understand that this is a time of judgment in the land. And therefore we might ask ourselves, is what I'm reading part of the evil that the Israelites were doing? Is the story that I'm reading right now part of the evil that the Israelites are doing? And secondly, we should be looking for that new leader that God would raise up to deliver the Israelites. So we might ask ourselves the first question, is this part of the evil that the Israelites were doing in the eyes of the Lord? And secondly, we might always be asking ourselves, is this person I'm reading about the judge that God is raising up to deliver Israel? As we're asking these questions, we read about the announcement of a birth to the wife of a man named Manoah. Now, the wife of Manoah is childless, we read at the beginning of chapter 13. And this fact alone places her squarely in a long line of childless women who receive baby announcements from a messenger of God. From Sarah, who we talked about a few weeks ago, to Mary, the mother of Jesus. From Hannah to Elizabeth, the announcement of a birth to a childless woman is a blessing from God, an answer to prayer. Now, we're rarely given any background to these announcements, but almost certainly they come at the end of a long line of heartache, a long line of miscarriages, perhaps, month after month of disappointment. It's too often a silent suffering that these women have experienced in the biblical account and in the 21st century. Maybe we can hold in tension as we read these birth announcements, hold in tension the joy of that present moment of the announcement with the suffering of the past. And maybe we can find a way to empathize. So the messenger of God appears to the wife of Manoah and announces that she will give birth to a son, and that she is to see that she conducts her pregnancy in a certain way, and that the boy is to be raised in a certain way. We read this in the first few verses of chapter 13. This boy is to be one who takes a Nazirite vow, to be dedicated to God from the womb, and that he will take the lead, as we read in the New International Version, take the lead in delivering Israel from the Philistines. This is the judge word in Hebrew. The idea of taking the lead is a clue to us as readers that this boy is to be the judge who will deliver the people of Israel from this current trial. It's a prophetic answer to that second question we're asking ourselves. So the woman, the wife of Manoah, does what you do. You go and tell someone. You receive a message from God, you go and tell someone. She tells her husband, "A man came to me. I didn't ask where he came from," she says. "And he didn't tell me his name," she says. This is a red flag, at least for me. If I'm Manoah in this situation, I didn't ask where he came from, and he didn't tell me his name. The man said, "You will become pregnant and have a son, and no razor is to touch his head, for he will be dedicated to God from the womb until the day of his death." All right, if you're Manoah, what's your reaction to this announcement? Do you have enough faith in your spouse to just take their word for it? I'm afraid to say, I don't. Do you simply dismiss it altogether as the ravings of a lunatic? I would hope not. Manoah's response is what I want to focus on for just a moment. So let's look at verse 8 of chapter 13 together. Then Manoah prayed to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I beg you to let the man of God you sent to come to us again, to teach us how to bring up the boy who is to be born." Manoah prayed to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I beg you to let the man of God you sent to us come again to teach us how to bring up the boy who is to be born." There's so much here. Manoah is caught between belief and unbelief, faith and doubt, hope and resignation. What's the thing he does first in this tension? When he's experiencing the tension between belief and unbelief, what does he do first? He prays. And even as I say it, it sounds to me like a cliche. And too often I treat it as a cliche and just ignore the impulse, ignore the encouragement throughout Scripture to lay our burdens, our tensions, our faith, and our doubt at the feet of Jesus. at the feet of our Lord. I should pray more. Period. I should be more willing to let God know about my doubt, which God already knows more fully than I can possibly imagine. Manoah prays, but he starts apologetically. He seems to know this is a prayer of doubt. Pardon your servant, Lord. Forgive me because of what I'm about to ask, what I'm about to beg even. I can see in this prayer of Manoah a vulnerability that I myself am afraid of. I'm afraid to ask for something that I feel like I shouldn't ask for. So I wouldn't even take the step of asking apologetically as Manoah does. I just wouldn't ask. But then look at what Manoah does ask. He asks for God to send the man again to teach them how to raise their son. Now, here are the assumptions that are built into this prayer. First of all, Manoah assumes that God is the sender of the messenger and the message. This is inherent in the fact that his petition is to God, and that God has the power to send the messenger again. Secondly, he assumes that the messenger actually came to his wife the first time. He asks God to send again the man who appeared once the first time. He does trust his wife a little bit. He also thirdly assumes the truth of half of the messenger's announcement. He assumes there's a boy to be born. Look at what Manoah does not ask. He doesn't ask for the man to come again and to confirm that his wife will indeed have a child. He assumes the child is to be born. Instead, he asks for the man to come again to confirm how the child who will be born is to be brought up. Amid all these assumptions, he doubts the Nazirite vow part of this announcement. Maybe the least difficult part of this whole thing for me. I'd have a lot more difficulty with the stranger who comes with a message from God, or the fact that this stranger comes with a message that means my wife, who is barren, is going to become pregnant and give birth to a son. The Nazirite vow part of this is inconsequential to me, but not to Manoah. This is his sticking point. This is his doubt, his unbelief. And so his prayer to God can be summarized, I do believe. Help my unbelief. Manoah has a little bit of faith, and it's rewarded. Because this is what God asks for over and over from his people. Have a little faith. Just a mustard seed's worth of faith. And it will be rewarded. I don't know what your tension is in this moment, what your doubt might be. There are plenty of doubts and uncertainties that we could choose from in this moment in 2020. I have two for myself. The first involves church. And I could put it under the heading of capital C church and little c church, because I've got a lot of doubt and uncertainty about where church goes after this COVID-19 crisis. This crisis that has forced us into empty buildings and cameras. This crisis has meant we don't know where to go from here. Even if somehow miraculously all restrictions were lifted and everything was safe for us to come back together right now, church will not be the same. Little C church in this building will not be the same. And capital C church around the globe isn't going to be the same. And so I have a lot of tension between what do we do after this? How does it look differently? Do we go into a mindset of having to rebuild church in some way or another? I think every little C church is going to have to go through that. And that creates a lot of tension, a lot of doubt, and a lot of uncertainty for me. Second area I've got a lot of doubt and uncertainty in right now is in my own family. My wife Brittany and I, we are in the process of trying to go toward adopting a child. Not a specific child, we're just at the very beginning of this process. And it creates a lot of doubt and uncertainty. I can resonate with Manoah's idea of how are we supposed to raise our children. I would love to have a messenger from God could tell me how to raise my children. But these areas of church and family are creating a lot of doubt, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of tension in my own life. It'll be different things for you. You'll have different things that you are going through right now that are creating doubt and tension and uncertainty, unbelief even, in you. The cycle of the story of Israel in the time of the judges and throughout the entire Old Testament is a cycle of unfaithfulness and outright rebellion. It's a cycle of doubt, of unbelief, but it's always followed by a demonstration of God's faithfulness. In fact, it's not just followed by a demonstration of God's faithfulness, it's preceded by a demonstration of God's faithfulness. God is faithful before and after our unfaithfulness. Here in the Samson story, God had delivered the people into the hand of the Philistines, and then God raises up Samson to deliver the people out of the hand of the Philistines. And it all starts with a little bit of faith. A little faith from Manoah's wife, a little faith from Manoah. It starts with a little bit of faith and a little bit of doubt. So whatever your tension is between doubt and faith right now, pray this prayer with me. Pray it with the assurance that God hears and delivers.